Hello. Hello, that's better. Right, I'm Mark. People call me a futurologist, which I don't really like, because I think most futurology is essentially bollocks. But what I'm going to talk about is the future of institutions, or can our institutions handle reality? So some of you might recognize this man. This is Douglas Adams. And he said there were three types of technology. There's a technology that's invented before you're born, which you don't really think of as technology. It's kind of just there, really. You know, sewers, paper. We don't really think of these things as technologies, but of course they are. So we're fairly ambivalent about that. And then he said there was a technology that's invented sort of between you being born and middle age, 35, 40, which is terribly exciting. And, you know, it's how we change the world. It's how you're going to, you know, form your new career. And for my generation, that's things like the internet and mobile phones and digital photography. So we're very happy about that. And he said there's a third type of technology, which is kind of invented after you're middle-aged, which is completely pointless and makes you angry. And for my generation, that's things like 3D television and Twitter. I mean, I have friends who are literally furious that Twitter even exists. Now, whilst that's very funny, the thing that interests me about that is if you look at the people who decide the strategic direction of a nation, or an organization, or a school, or even a family, they're usually in the last category. But most of their stakeholders, or employees, or customers, or citizens are in the second one. And this leads to what I call institutional bewilderment. As institutions just kind of stand there, as we've seen quite often, in the face of new technology and go, I don't really know what to do. And I'm going to give an example from my own life. So I had my genome profiled, my genetic code profiled a few years ago, and that tells me some genetic propensities I have for certain traits or diseases, and I can log on and see them. I'm glad you've all had lunch, because it turns out that my arse is the weak link genetically. So the average risk of getting prostate cancer by the age of about 80 for a white Northern European male like myself is about 18% on average. But it turns out that I'm nearly double that, so sort of up at nearly 32%. Now, I know from my work with medical research charities that this puts me into the same risk category as black men. Black men, because of a quirk of the genetics associated with that ethnicity, have, on average, a 2 to 3 times higher risk of getting prostate cancer than white men. So very sensibly, the National Health Service says, if you're a black man and you get to the age of about 40, if you've come in for something else, you've got a cold, they'll say, while you're in here, can we possibly encourage you to have some early tests for prostate cancer? Now, I'm 42. I thought, well, I'm falling into roughly the same risk category. So I went to my doctor, and I said, maybe I should have some of those early tests as well. What did my doctor say? That's pretty much what she said. No, she actually said, you do realize you're not black. It's not really the quality of healthcare I was looking for. And I explained my genetics, and I said, look, this is what's going on. And she said, look, the rule's very clear, Mr. Stevenson. If you're black, you get the test, and if you're white, you don't. Now, here's the question. Is my doctor a racist? Well, no. Of course she's not a racist. But what she is doing is holding on to a kind of a system of doing things and organizing things that kind of doesn't make sense anymore in the light of new technology. And I think we're seeing that all around us at the moment. You know, we have school systems that are kind of creating a belief in rote learning when most of the kids are going to have to invent their own jobs. We have workplaces where 2/3 of people are actively disengaged from their work. We have an energy system that can't keep up with demand and is visiting on us an environmental crisis of unprecedented proportions, and yet we have the technology and the knowledge to solve all of these problems. And the technology is coming very fast. This is Anthony Atala. He runs the Wake Forest Institute of Regenerative Medicine in North Carolina, and just that machine blurred out behind him is a 3D bioprinter. And in his hand, it's a prototype human kidney that came off that printer in about 5 hours. Fantastic technology. Do you think the National Health Service is wondering what to do with that? Because I can tell you that they're not. At the same time, the cost of genome sequencing is plummeting. $100 million it cost to sequence the first human genome sequence, the genetic code of an entire human being. That was in 2001. Today, we can do the same thing commercially for just $5,000. And that trend is actually outstripping Moore's law, the stratospheric law of computing that explains why your mobile phone has more processing power in it than the entire Apollo space mission. Okay? Genome sequencing is now outstripping that trend by a factor of 4, and it's speeding up. And what that means is that the 1 cent human genome sequence will probably be here before the middle of the next decade. What does that do to healthcare? Well, one of the things it allows you to do is, for instance, take a patient with cancer, and sequence 2 cells from them very cheaply, one that's healthy, one that's cancerous, and compare them. Now, this has already been done in a few groundbreaking studies. This is a very upsetting scan. This is a PET scan, and this is most of the blobs on that scan, the black blobs, except for the one between the legs, they are tumors. This is melanoma. This is a dead man walking. The melanoma has gone inside him, it's infected his organs. This is not a good place to be. This man is very few days away from death. Now, he worked in Boston at a medical research institute where they had genome sequencing devices, and they sequenced 2 cells from him, one that was cancerous and one that was healthy. And by coincidence, they found they were working on a genetic drug that targeted the same mutations in the genome that he had. With nothing left to lose, they gave it to him. 15 days later, he walked out of hospital cancer-free. Now, let's not overstate this. That man's cancer will almost certainly come back in a different form. Nonetheless, we're talking about reprogramming a human being from the genetic level up the way we reprogram a computer. Is our healthcare system thinking about this technology? No, it is not. And just as we've learned to read genomes, we've learned to write them, such that we can get bacteria to change their metabolism such that they can eat CO2, eat carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and excrete crude oil. Eat CO2 from the atmosphere and excrete crude oil. And so people are already thinking about something like this, carbon-neutral oil refinery. And I sit on the Fuels and Transport Committee at the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, and we think this is probably about 15 or 20 years away from being commercially viable. Now, is the transport industry thinking about what's going to happen when that comes along? No, it is not. The cost of solar power is plummeting. The top line is adjusted for inflation. Solar power is dropping between 5 and 6% per annum every year for the last 30 years. What that means is possibly cheap, ubiquitous solar power for everybody on the planet within a generation. Is the energy industry thinking about this? Well, some of them are. This is a report from the Edison Electrical Institute in America, and this is kind of the Association of Shareholder-Owned Utilities in America. And they've looked at what's happening with solar, and the fact actually, it's actually starting to be owned by people, and small corporations and communities and individuals rather than big utilities. And the executive summary of this report is essentially, oh shit. Here comes the internet to the world of energy. But this has huge geopolitical implications, and people aren't thinking about these. These people really excite me. This is the Global Village Construction Set from Open Source Ecology. What they're doing right now is putting online, open source, the designs of 50 different machines, which are what they say are required to make a small industrial civilization with modern comforts, using techniques like 3D printing. What does this do to our economies and lots of our jobs? Who's thinking about this? Is the Department of Trade and Industry? No, it is not. Even more amazing, this is Nanoscribe. Nanoscribe, company I'm going to see in a few weeks, they print on the nanoscale. They print components on the nanoscale. The first thing they printed was that replica spaceship from the not very successful sci-fi movie Wing Commander, which tells you quite a lot about the people who work at Nanoscribe. But that thing on the right, they printed soon afterwards, that's a scaffold for holding individual cells for medical applications. And right now, they make their money by printing optical imaging components on the nanoscale for medical imaging machines. And this points to a world, this technology points to a world where 3D printers will be able to print all the components necessary to make 3D printers. And that's the end of the Industrial Revolution. Are people thinking about that? Well, some people are, but not many. You see, the digital revolution, which we're so happy about, we've talked a lot about at FutureFest, and rightly so, which has changed everything, well, that really was just the cocktail sausage before dinner. If you thought digital was a big deal, you better strap yourself in, because that level of programmability and power and democratization is coming to the physical world through programmable biology and programmable matter. Now, ask yourself, are your kids getting the education they need to deal with this world? No, they are not. It will change the definition of wealth. Wealth is influence and power. You'll have influence because you have a big amount of money in your bank account, which means you can influence things to happen. But what happens when the average guy in the street and on the average wage has his own fuel source in his back garden and his own 3D printer to make loads of stuff he doesn't have to buy anymore? Your ability to influence me because you're rich has suddenly eroded slightly. It's not gone entirely, but it's eroded slightly. And the billionaire investors I work with, they don't like this. But what I say to them is, well, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. My favorite quote from Philip K. Dick, the man who wrote the film, the book that became Blade Runner. Reality is that which, when you stop believing it, doesn't go away. There is no record company executive anywhere in the world right now who doesn't want to wake up tomorrow morning and find out the internet had just been a bad dream. But reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. So as we look to the future, FutureFest, and who knows what's going to happen, but one thing we do know is it's going to be what John C. Brown calls a big shift. Other people call it the Great Turbulence. And that has some very interesting implications for our institutions. And that's something I hope we're going to explore after the break with the speakers that are coming after me. It brings the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's start with the bad. Our organizations are not fit for purpose. Who here thinks the governmental system we have is really rocking it? Who thinks the education system is doing a fabulous job? Who thinks we've got it right in healthcare? Anybody? Right. A room full of people from different backgrounds, different politics, and all of us agree that our institutions are no longer fit for purpose, which means they're going to fail. The good news is we have these remarkable tools to remake our world. But the ugly news is it's going to get messy. The next 30 years are going to be the messiest 30 years you've ever seen. So where do we look to for these new institutions? Who is going to create them? Well, let's look back to the digital revolution, because I think the digital revolution was a bit like a trailer for the main feature. Because think about it. PayPal was not invented by the banks. Amazon was not invented by a bookshop. Instagram sent Kodak bust. Instagram was 2 years old when Kodak, a company 132 years old, who had invented the digital camera, disappeared into obscurity. Spotify was not an initiative of the record industry, and Skype was not invented by people from the telecoms industry. So maybe looking at our existing institutions to reform themselves is a bit like waiting for Jeremy Clarkson to write a feminist novel. Who are we going to look to? Maybe we look to people like this. Patients Like Me, a platform where patients with conditions share their data with each other and their experiences of it, so they get a support community, but also all that data starts to inform clinical research. So people come together in a crowd to be both patients and researchers. The Open Source Drug Discovery Project. An open source drug discovery project out of India. Why was this created? Because we sequenced the tuberculosis genome 10 years ago, and the pharmaceutical industry has yet to produce a drug for tuberculosis. Okay? And that disease kills 1,000 people in India every day. So some Indian guys got together and said, let's do this open source. And they've just gone into human trials with the first new drug for tuberculosis in February this year. Nothing to do with the traditional healthcare industry. What about the island of Samso? It's just off Denmark, gone completely off-grid. Completely off-grid. And the guy who runs it out there, he says, we're actually quite dull people. Well, they're not dull to me, like they've done something amazing. They've created a whole new environment by which to run their economy. Or what about a self-organized learning environment? This is suggested by Sugata Mitra, who's trying to create a cloud-based learning system where people organize their own learning. No schools, hardly any teachers. People actually organize themselves into learning environments. Is this what we should be looking at? Because what all these things say to me, I think, is that the world is changing. You see, when it came to the information revolution, we soon began to realize that we weren't just passive consumers of information anymore. We could publish, we could tweet, we could write emails, we could have our own blogs. We became consumers and publishers if we wanted to be. So maybe this is what's going to happen. As the energy revolution starts to come with solar and renewables, we become consumers and producers of energy. In medicine, we become patients and medical researchers. In education, maybe we're students and teachers. So maybe when it comes to government, we have to realize that we become citizen and state. Because what you're seeing in all these examples is not the usual suspects doing anything. It's people coding around the problems with democracy by getting on and doing it anyway, saying, look, I don't really know about healthcare, but I do know about energy, so let's take the town off grid. The transition towns movement is something you would expect a government to be doing, but they're not. We're doing it. Now, that is brilliant in some ways, but it also brings a huge amount of responsibility, because we complain about the government not looking after us properly or not really dealing with the moral issues of the day. Well, that responsibility now comes to us with these new tools. So you are citizen and state. Perhaps it is less of a big shift. Perhaps it's more of a mass shuffle. I want to leave you with this thought, though, because this is the future you're going into, a future that you must shape and you must control. Viktor Frankl, who escaped Auschwitz, made a life in America, wrote in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, when we erected a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast, we forgot to erect a statue of responsibility on the West Coast. That is something we'll be thinking about after we have the break with the other sessions. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you then.